morning. This is Diane Kelly with Sandbrick Group in Tucson, Arizona. And today I'm going to introduce you to three lovely ladies who work primarily with seniors who need to leave their homes and go into a care facility in the area. And we feel it's really important to get this information out there that these types of services are available. I've talked to people over the years who are trying to do this all themselves. Do not do that. You can get qualified help, and these ladies are very qualified in their respective areas with all kinds of certifications and backgrounds extensive in working with seniors. So I'd like to introduce you to Kathleen Gordon, Kathy Bell, and Alice Barrett. And we're going to ask them some leading questions today to get a little bit more information out there for you so you know what their services are, how you can access it, and why it's so important for you. And I'm going to start off today with Kathleen, and you're going to tell us what is your business and why is it so important for families to know about your business?
Well, thanks, Diane, for having us. So our business is we are senior living consultants with a right place for seniors. And basically what we do is we help guide families through that process when their elderly loved one is no longer able to care for themselves. So we help them find primarily assisted living or memory care. And we also work on independent living and in-home services. And what we find is that it is such an emotional process for the families. There are so many variables to look at, and it can be so stressful. So having a professional like one of us kind of take off some of that stress, and we can guide them through that process. We have researched the facilities, and so we know really well what they're looking for. And we just guide them through that whole process and stay with them until their loved one has moved in.
That's awesome. That's really valuable. And Kathy, when should they think about contacting you?
I think one of the most important nudges that we've learned from families over the years is that something has changed, and you usually talk to a friend about it, or you usually reach out to someone and say, this just happened, what does it mean? So we normally understand that nudge when we're referencing a child, our own child, or a pet, or someone that we've gotten to know very well in our lives. So there's an indicator, there's a nudge, there's something that doesn't feel particularly similar. So you're wondering, what's going on there? So when should somebody call us? Then, when you see that nudge, when you feel that nudge, when there's an indicator that's telling you something's different, you see that number on the screen? That's the number you call. That's when you call us. We want to hear your story. We want to know what it is that you're sensing, that you're seeing that's different. And then we have a great way of making a checklist or a roadmap, or just having a great conversation with you to give you some ideas of what to do next.
Yeah, and I find that this is an area where people tend to wait way too long. I have literally had people call me, adult children generally are the ones that I'm talking to, because mom or dad or their spouse is in the hospital and they're releasing them and they cannot go home and live by themselves. That's a crisis, and that's a crisis you want to avoid at all possible expense. But I know that sometimes that happens anyway. But I think some of the things that I've seen as triggers, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is unkemptness. They're not showering. Maybe their clothes are dirty. They're not managing their finances the way that they have in the past, things like that. Is that generally those triggers that you would look for?
I think all of us have stories just along those lines, and we're all ready to jump in on that question.
Yeah.
I think when you get to that point, there were those subtle signs that were before that.
Okay.
So when you're finally noticing that they're not showering, when you know that sometimes, I mean, we could probably tell different stories about it, but I think that at that point it's blatant and it's in your space now. And so we're looking to help families when they get that sense, when there's that simple nudge. When your parents are 50, there's things change. When your parents are 60, things change. So hopefully our goal today is to give everybody permission to give us that phone call. Something's different. We're like firefighters. We want to see where the flame is before it's a fire.
Agreed.
Another thing, Diane, is that some of those sometimes family members see those things that you're talking about, like, oh, my mom or my dad has that disheveled appearance. They're not taking care, they're not doing their personal hygiene as well as they used to. But emotionally, it is really difficult because we run into family members where they say, oh, I promised my mom or my dad I will take care of them forever. I'm never going to put them in a nursing home, something like that. And a lot of that, we find the need for some education.
Absolutely. And I think that another hard part too is sometimes the children are not domiciled here. So all they have is phone calls. So they need to be very aware in the phone call if the parent or whomever they're talking to is starting to lose track of what they're talking about. They seem to be a little confused, things like that they can kind of read over the phone. But I've actually worked in situations where the kids are not local and they're starting to worry about mom or dad. So that's really important that they get there. So Alice, are there certain emotional or behavioral triggers that the family members should be aware of?
Often there are, and I'll probably have to share some stories to answer your question, but what I really want to preface is that communication with the family member early, as early as possible in your early 20s, start dialoguing with your parents because they're probably in their 40s by then, and make sure you establish a trusting communication with them, but recognize their baseline style of communication. Is it always happy and joyful, or is it always with some anger or sadness? Maybe on a depressed,
Like a personality type.
Yeah, personality types and styles of dialoguing, because often you'll notice in their communication subtle things like, I have a friend whose mother was a nurse and she always was quiet, never talked, hardly ever talked to her as to her daughter. And when she did, it was with a tone of anger. And so her daughter was always a little taken back by her mom. And she didn't live with her, but she would visit her often. And she noticed her mother was getting angrier and angrier and angrier as she went through her daily work situation, and to the point where her anger got out of control, and she didn't know what was going on with mom. And she figured, well, that's how she always has been. She's just an angry person. But her mom was progressing from an early stage of dementia to, by the time she recognized this anger, it incapacitated her. She was losing her job. She wasn't able to function. And she was in Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's state. By the time they worked her up, it was so far past, she had an early death from Alzheimer's, and they had to take care of her at home. They had no options. They didn't know what to do, and they didn't know who to call. And now we have these services that we're offering that are free, and they're such nice facilities that we can work with the family and their budget to help them not have the burden. But they have to look at the situation early. And she missed it because her mom was always angry as a child. So she just didn't catch on that this anger was building, and that was her symptom of her disease or her disorder or what was going on. And she missed it, and she felt sorry about that. Most of her adult life now, she regrets that mistake. It's not a mistake. It's so easy to miss the subtle symptoms.
And to kind of pass it off as that's their temperament, or that's how they've always been. So I think that's really important. And the other thing you said, Alice, that's really important is communication. And having these conversations early on with your children. And the hard part we find is a lot of times, especially if they're advanced with dementia or some of these issues, they fight really hard not to give up their independence because that's all they're holding on to. And that becomes a huge trigger in the family. It can really, I mean, it can hurt families because there's dissension among the troops of how to handle this. We don't want to force mom or dad out of their home, but it's for their safety. Where do we go from here? All those issues. And it can be really emotional, like you said, definitely emotional.
That's a really good point, Diane. And that whole emotional piece, again, it's something where when I am working with families and they're struggling to make a decision about, well, what should we do for mom or dad? Where I come in and I say, safety is number one. You want to make sure that your mom or dad is safe. Let's look at the best options for their care. And that's kind of a one way that we can kind of help bring folks together in terms of everybody being on the same page. Okay, where's the best, safest place?
Right. And that may be easier in talking to the adult children, that they want mom or dad to be safe. And mom and dad may feel like, I don't need any help.
I think that's a great pivot point, is when you can put that card on the table that says safety is going to be the priority, because then it begins eliminating all of those other things that you just talked about, where the emotions start getting involved and people start conflicting with each other at what is best. I think Alice was talking about it earlier today when she was referencing being the bedside nurse, and then the arguments started, the fights started, you know, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's true. So Kathleen, obviously this is a good service and people need to know that you exist. So how much do they have to pay for your services?
Well, that's, one of the best things is that when families come to us, and a lot of times they're stressed out, someone had a fall, they're in the hospital, they go, okay, that sounds great, but how much do I have to pay you? They don't have to pay anything for our services. Our services are free for the families. We get paid at the back end. It's strictly on commission. We have contracts with the communities. And so it's great because the families can use our services. There is no cost to have that conversation that really is so important in getting everybody on the same page. And there's different ways to cover the cost. I would guide them to someone like you who has that experience in helping them to figure out how to cover the cost for the care.
Yeah. Now, obviously your service is free, but the cost of care is not. So my position is how to pay for that. And obviously at the time when they're going into a facility isn't the time to discuss that either. Those are conversations that need to be held much earlier than that and prepared for. And we can suggest that if they have a health savings account, they can pay for care out of their health savings account. If they have significant amounts of money built up in there, hopefully they've done some planning for long-term care. I know there's a lot of statistics out there. Generally, you're living longer, we are, and the longer you live, the more likely it is that you're going to need long-term care at some point in time. My own mom just went into long-term care last year at the age of 90 after a fall. So, unfortunately, I had long-term care insurance on her, which is paying the cost of care. It's not paying for her basic room and board, which is another issue, but it is paying for the cost of care, almost to the tune of about $2,000 a month. So we're very grateful for that. When it comes down to care, sometimes when they're leaving their primary home, obviously they have to sell their residence, and that provides hopefully some money for them to pay for care going forward. But proper planning is always needed at the front end and earlier rather than later. So yeah, good information there. So Alice, how can the family take an active role in that care without having to be a full-time caregiver? Because I've had people who have had to do that, and it is stressful. They aren't equipped for that type of care, and it takes a toll on everybody. So how can they take an active role without actually doing the service?
Prevention. You have to act early. You have to do some homework. I have a great example. My mother in her 80s, my family wanted to go on a trip to Hawaii, and they asked me to fly from Tucson to New York to take care of mom. So I did. And on the airplane, I sat next to a gerontologist, and the gerontologist was the only one on Long Island. And so I thought, wow, my mom should probably be evaluated by a gerontologist. Perfect. I'll try and get her in with this doctor. And I have to do it within 2 weeks because I'm going to go back to Tucson, but it'll be great. I'll know everything about my mom, baseline data, gerontologist, neuropsych, geri-psych, heart, lungs. I'll do whatever he tells me. So I took her to all this. I took her to all these consultants he sent. I took her to the gerontologist, and he did a mini mental test on her, which she did not want to do because she thought it was insulting. He asked her simplified questions, and she wasn't going to answer because my mother's also very quiet. When she speaks, it's important. Otherwise, she has nothing to say. And so when he asked her, what's this? And he was pointing to his watch, she sat there quietly. And I had to say, Doc, could I talk to mom? He goes, don't tell her the answer. I said, no, I'm not going to tell her the answer. Just let me tell her something important. Mother, answer his questions the best you can. Because if you don't answer the questions, he's going to think you don't understand and you don't know. And I know you understand. So please let him know. She blew through the test. It was perfect, but she was going to sit there and do nothing. She'd have failed the test had I not been in the office with them at that time.
That's a good one.
Then he took and sent me to, your mother needs to see a neurologist, she needs to see a cardiologist, and she needs to see a GI doctor. And I said, okay, great. So I took her to all those doctors. Family comes home. I got all this data, baseline data. I know she has the consultants set up. If something happens, they know who and what, and that person knows her. And my family was so mad at me for ruining the time that I could have spent with my mother by dragging her all over the island to see all these doctors. About 7 months go by and mom's in trouble. And they call me and I go, you got the information, take her to this one and this one. 2 months later, they send me a beautiful gift thanking me for having done that because it was all taken care of. And mom went another 10 years without needing any of those doctors. And then she needed them, but they were all set up. So prevention, that's the best answer. Go with them to their doctor appointments. Make sure the answer to the question is correct. That's the best I can tell you.
Yeah, that's huge. And I know from my own experience with my mom, there came a point where she's going to the doctor and she cut back and would say, what did the doctor say? And she'd go, I don't remember.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're like, okay, we need to start going with mom to the doctor appointments, right? Because, and we explained it to her nicely and said, you know what, mom, I know it's really confusing when you go into the doctor's office and they're spewing all this stuff to you and some of it you understand, some of it you don't. We just want to come with you so that we have 2 ears, and maybe between us, we can figure out exactly what they're telling you so that we can make sure you get the proper care. So, you got to kind of soften the blow sometimes and say, we're not coming to take over.
Yeah.
They look at it that way too. Yeah.
But you brought up a great point though there, Diane, in that as adults, elderly adults, they still have that privilege. They still have that right.
Yeah.
They still have that final say when it comes to everything that we think we want to do for our family. They have the right to make a bad choice. And we can do as much prevention and getting involved and suggestions and whatnot. But you make a great point there in that they still can dictate what happens with their future. So I think that's the big plus about having our conversation today with you is that we are looking forward to having those early discussions with family members, with your clients, with the relationships that we send this information out to. That we are truly looking to understand your story, the story, so that we can help make better decisions, best decisions, some kind of steps to interact with the senior of their life, the senior loved ones in their life.
And I mean, it even comes down to sometimes not letting mom or dad drive any longer and taking away the car keys, and taking away the car. And from personal experience in dealing with this with clients, it's a really tough thing. I remember my mother-in-law was starting to have dementia, and so we basically took away her car keys because she got lost a lot and it was scary for her to be out on the road. And then one day she says, where's my car? I said, well, mom, don't you remember you gave it to Jessica, her granddaughter, so she could go to college. And as a former teacher, she went, oh yeah, that's right. So, sometimes you got to kind of soften the blow and say, oh, remember you did this for this benefit and you're helping somebody. And that kind of took the sting out of the fact that her car wasn't there anymore.
You know what, Diane, that is fantastic. And I will tell you, from my own experience, and I was just talking with our other consultants yesterday about this, from in our family. My mother was in a situation where she was ill and in and out of hospital and rehab. And so with our large family, we were kind of taking turns driving my dad. I was with him, I took him home and I said, hey, just want to let you know, remember Margaret's coming later to pick you up for dinner. Okay. And he forgot. And so he decided, you know what, I'm just going to go run down the street, just go get a hamburger. Well, he got in his car, a 92-year-old man who had never caused an accident in his life, and backed up from his usual parking spot into a parked car. And when he realized what he had done, then he gunned it, went forward back to the parking spot, up an embankment and into an apartment building, and then came back down into the parking spot. Thank God nobody was injured in that. Nobody was in the apartment building, nobody in the parked car, and my father was okay physically. The police came, they asked him some basic questions. Can you tell me what day it is? Do you know the date? Do you know who the president is? He passed with flying colors and he was so nice and cooperative. No, they weren't going to do anything. He had his driver's license, but he did not drive anymore.
Wow. Yeah. And that's the worst end of it. Thank God, like you said, nobody was injured because it could have been worse.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But when I hear people, family members struggling, how should I have that conversation? Oh, I'm really scared. I use my dad as an example. Better safe than sorry.
Yeah, that's a great story. And it's certainly something, again, one of those triggers that we were talking about to look for if they're getting confused when they're driving, or get in the car with your parent while they're driving. Scary as that might be. and
Diane, I think it's interesting when you look at those, those subtle signs. We had a client that was falling. And so the family called us because they really thought the worst of the situation, when it ended up being she needed to have her ears cleaned.
Wow.
She needed to have her balance free.
Vertigo, yeah.
Because her equilibrium was off. She was what, 80, 85. She had never had her ears cleaned. So the goal is definitely that early prevention. And we don't want you to think the worst. We want you to talk with us so that we can say, it could be something so simple that we can help make a difference early on. And it was cleaning her ears.
Yeah. And having people like you who are professionals to kind of assess the situation helps, because as a layperson, I wouldn't even think about that. Although I have heard that hearing loss is very prevalent and can actually bring on the onset of dementia. So if there's a hearing loss, they can also lose some of their faculties, but it's not attached to anything in the brain per se. It's just that they aren't hearing properly. So all these things are very helpful when you bring people like yourselves who have a long history of working with people in these things and can spot things maybe I wouldn't see with my loved one. So I think that is beyond valuable. And then Kathleen, also, a lot of people, when they go into a facility, it's a huge change. I know when we put my mom in her facility, she went into independent living. Now she's in assisted living, but we had to downsize everything. It was a massive thing. We gave a lot of stuff away to the goose up in Catalina because it was just too much to deal with. And it's traumatic. And one of the other things that they're concerned about is, am I going to have to change my doctor? What are all these changes that they're going to have to go through in order to move into a facility? So maybe you can address some of the top concerns.
That is a really good question, Diane. You know, there are some physicians or nurse practitioners that will continue to see their clients, the patients, and then most commonly what we see is that when a senior moves into a community, there is a group, a medical group that sees those residents on a regular basis. So many times, even if the ones that do want to keep their doctor, eventually they kind of switch over, not because they have to, but because it's more convenient. And sometimes the other physicians will encourage them to do that. And again, a lot of these communities will provide transportation for medical appointments. So that's something really convenient. It takes away that stress of, oh, mom or dad driving and, how are we going to get there? That kind of thing. So, yeah.
Very important. And I would also mention that if they are going into assisted living, that is a trigger for Medicare, and it's a special enrollment period. So to your point, if they do want to have the physician who's visiting on site, as opposed to going out for a doctor visit any longer, we can check the network. And if their network does not include that provider, we can actually switch them at that time to another plan that does include the provider. And I know that happened with my mom, especially through COVID, right? They weren't taking people out, and yet she still needed to have some medical care. So at that point, we switched over to the provider who comes into the facility, and it's been great because we have a communication line with somebody who's actually physically there, as well as the staff of the facility. So everybody's kind of tied into what's going on with mom, which makes me a lot more comfortable knowing that. So I think that that's really important. So there are a lot of changes when they're going into a facility. Now back to having to downsize and everything. How do you guys help with that? I mean, I know that you have resources that you could bring in to help with that process. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, I know from working, and I think all of us know from working with the different care facilities, that they usually have their relationships that are well acquainted with any of the buildings, the ramps, the room sizes. There are care homes, senior care communities that have people that will just come in and help you set up. They give you 10 free hours of being able to help move your furniture around, completely unpack you. So there's a number of ways to look at the downsizing. I think one of the biggest indicators we were talking about earlier this morning was when you find that your parents are really living in one room. They're really just kind of living in one space. They're not really taking on the rest of the house. And there's just a lot of emptiness. Then, starting to figure out, how are we going to deal with all of these items? So there's a number of services that can help with that. But I know just in my own personal experience, after my mom's fall, we had Habitat for Humanity come into her apartment, and they chose the items that they wanted. My mom chose the items that were going to stay in the family, and the majority of the house went out the door.
Yeah, and that's again pretty much what we did with my mom with the Goose. We just had them come in, they brought in their trucks, and they took out everything that we didn't want to have to move. There's also estate sales. So they can contract with somebody to do an estate sale if they have things of value and want to create some revenue stream off of it too. So we can absolutely refer them out, and I'm sure you can too in that regard. So are there some other subtle signs that family members can take notice of in things that they tell their healthcare provider and kind of collaborate with that healthcare provider, Alice? Is there something that the families can be doing in that conversation, saying, hey, doc, this is going on. Can you assess that, and get another set of eyes on it, I guess is what it is.
So you mean when they've gone to a healthcare provider and they're
well, the subtle signs are the things that tells you that they need a healthcare provider, that they need to get additional services, kind of like what you did for your mom.
Right.
Yeah.
Hydration is a big deal.
Exactly. You just have to know their baseline. You just have to know what their normal is, because if you know the normal, then you can tell the abnormal. And basically, I would say, I'm in Tucson, my family's in New York, so I have to rely on them. But I remember one time I called my sister and I almost hung up because her voice was not like my sister, and she didn't have that New York accent. It sounded like somebody who was having a stroke. And so I said, is your daughter home? And she said, yes. So I said, put your daughter on the phone. Well, I said, Deborah, what's wrong with your mom? I didn't think it was my sister. I thought that was the wrong number. I was going to hang up. She goes, Mom's not been swallowing well. Dad's been staying up, making sure she swallows at night. She's not doing well. And Dad wants to take care of her. I said, you have to take her to the hospital now. Something is wrong with her. She's not articulating. She's not swallowing. You're taking care of her like she's a patient. Do this for me. You take her to the hospital now. Don't take her to the doctor. It's going to take too long. She needs to go to the hospital. She's going to aspirate something and die.
Wow.
But it was her voice. And she didn't have her accent. And I know my sister's baseline is she's a health freak. Why do you sound like someone I want to hang up on? I don't know you. I'm 3,000 miles away. I can't do it, but you have to do it. And so they did. So it's sort of like knowing the norm. And you can do it from a distance. You don't even have to be in the same house.
That's a good story.
So it's hard to pick up subtle things. So if you know their norm, you can pick up the subtle.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I think that, like I was talking about, adult children like yourself being a distance away, having those regular conversations, knowing what's normal and being aware of when things don't sound right. If they're slurring the words or if they're losing words, they're not able to communicate in the way that you're used to having them communicate. That's a good trigger.
Yep, we have a family that the younger people were talking to the parent on the phone and learned that the dad had injured his back gardening. And so they would take turns calling him, and second or third phone call, he was mentioning that he was putting together a walker. And they're like, wait a second, Dad, you don't use a walker. Why are you putting together a walker?
Yeah.
One of the closest daughter flew in. She said that was enough to say, there's something clearly wrong. Our dad would not put together a walker. He just flippantly added that comment in the conversation, but it was enough of a nudge that she flew in to see what was going on with Dad. And thank God she did, because he has a fractured back.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
it's that nudge, it's that visceral feeling that says, okay, something's clearly not right. We've got to get somebody else involved, if not myself, who can be there, because something's changed.
And I hear that a lot too. It's like, I don't want to bother the kids, right? I don't want to bother you with this little pain that I'm having, and I fractured my back.
And what the other thing is, you might have the parent saying, oh, I don't want to bother the kids. I don't want to be a burden to my family. Yep. I hear that a lot. Yep. And on the other side, in terms of things to look for, another thing is their participation. So for example, if your mom or your dad really loves to play cards, and you can go over and kind of get them involved by playing a game of hearts or whatever it is, that they like, and they usually win. And then you find that they're saying, oh, no, thanks. I'm just not up to it right now. Or I'm just a little tired. And they're doing that more. That is one of those subtle signs. As older people tend to recognize that they have some of that mild cognitive impairment, and they're sort of in between. It's like they know that something's wrong, but they're not quite sure what to do and where to go. And so they cope with that by just avoiding situations.
Yeah. And that can also be a sign of depression.
Yes.
And I think that we have to be really cognizant of what happened to a lot of our seniors through these past couple of years, where they're in lockdown and stuck in their rooms. And my mom, for instance, is very social, and she's gotten so comfortable in staying in her room that we can't get her out now. And it's hard, because she was very social and she'd like to play bingo and all this other stuff. And now it's almost too much effort for her to get dressed and go down. So yeah, it's kind of a tough one sometimes, and especially for the adult children to watch that happen. But we can encourage and we can be there for them. And that's really important. And like Alice was saying, that communication early on is so important. I've had those conversations with my children. My daughter was really funny one day. She said, Mom, I'll never put you in a nursing home. I said, well, thanks. I said, but you'll never have to pay for it either. I've made provision for that, thankfully. So, well, thank you, ladies. I think that this is really valuable information. I'm glad we're getting this out to the general public, to our clients, to our loved ones, and certainly the service that you offer is extremely valuable. But also, in addition to that, all of your experience and your stories that come with this, because you have an awareness that people need to have brought to the fore. And that's what we're trying to do with this presentation. So I appreciate all of you today. And again, thank you to all of you with the right place for seniors, and that you will help them find the right place. You'll consider their budget, case management. We'll look at what their assessment is, what they need going in. They might just need home care for a while and then have to move into assisted living. So it's all part of the process. So I thank you very much for being here today, everybody.
You're awesome,
Thank you.
Diane. Thank
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you.